Thank you. Thank you very much.
Now, in order to help us even more, the EEOC has given us some guidance on requesting reasonable accommodations. So one of the first issues here is how specific must an individual be when requesting a reasonable accommodation? Well, the EEOC tells us to request an accommodation, the person only has to use plain English. They don't have to go up and say, well, I need coverage under the Rehab Act or under the ADA. And they don't have to say things like reasonable accommodation. For example, one of the instances they give us is you have to consider whether an employee comes up and asks for time off. So someone typically comes up and asks for time off, and they might say something like that they are really stressed and depressed. Well, just that right there. The employee has sufficiently communicated to you a request for a change in work, some time off is basically what they've asked for, and they've told you about a medical condition. That is a reasonable accommodation request. And that should spark you right there that you need to get a medical certification, call human resources, get all of this verified. So you're going to get it verified as to what the condition is and what their limitations are. Now, obviously, if somebody is experiencing a disability and it's obvious, like they come in on crutches, or something like this, or they're, hooking up an insulin pump or something like that, clearly it's been communicated to you. But here, they just come up and make it known, and that's good enough. You are on notice. Did you know, or should you have known? And the answer is yes. Another instance that they give us is, may an employer require the employee to go to a healthcare professional of the employer's choice for the purpose of documenting the need for an accommodation? And as I just mentioned, yes, absolutely. You need to get this verified. You set up the appointment, you tell them, hey, you got to go. And that's a good reason to have a physician that you typically deal with. Someone that specializes in industrial health, that understands accommodations and things like this. That's a very good idea. But you want to make sure that you are verifying what it is that they've got and those limitations. And it makes sense. How can you give a reasonable accommodation to something if you don't know what their limitations are? Well, let's look at requesting a reasonable accommodation. Now, one of the big controversies over the last several years of the ADA is what exactly does an employee have to say to request a reasonable accommodation? And if you look at your materials, the ADA is very clear. An individual must request an accommodation. So unlike the FMLA, where an employer is supposed to be, quote, reasonably aware, under the ADA, the employee actually has to request the accommodation. And the EEOC has been very clear. They have said it is the responsibility of the individual with a disability to inform the employer that an accommodation is needed. So this begs the question, what exactly does an employee have to say that starts this reasonable accommodation that kicks in their rights under the ADA? What exactly does an employee have to say? Well, in the past, if an employee just simply requested time off for a reason related to a disability, like, hey, I need 6 weeks off to get, treatment for my back problem, that would do it. That was a request for a reasonable accommodation. And as soon as that happens, that kicks in the interactive process in which you discuss with the employee, what all can we do to help you? What do you need? That also initiates the medical certification and all that good stuff. Well, let's look at this realistically. What are the chances that an employee is going to always come up and say, boom, I've got this condition and I need some help? Okay, so that got a real sticky issue for a lot of employers and for the EEOC. Because a lot of times the employer would say, well, he or she never told us. Well, this brought up the new test, or what the EEOC is saying now that an employee has to do. And really, it's very simple. Employers, you absolutely have to have your antennas up to this. All an employee has to do is, number one, say that they need a change at work. Like, I need some time off, or I need a better chair, or something like this. And we'll look at some examples of that. And two, it's because of a medical condition, which that includes mental conditions. That's it. That's all that is necessary to start the interactive process, to request a reasonable accommodation. And of course, what all that is it initiates the employee's rights under the ADA. So the test, the bar, is actually now very low. And this is a major problem for employers. So you absolutely have to have your supervisor's ears up to what an employee has to say to initiate the ADA. All they got to do is say, hey, I need a change, and it's due to some mental or physical condition. That is it. So let's look at a few examples here, and I think this will help to drive this point home. Matilda versus Colvin. Well, you had a situation where you got this employee, and she says that she needs to have a new supervisor because of her mental illness. Okay, well, first of all, just because you're depressed or have anxiety or something like this, asking for a new supervisor is not a reasonable accommodation. All right, so that just isn't it right there. But look what she has done. Has she told you that she wants an adjustment or change at work? And the answer to that is yes, absolutely. I want a new supervisor. And has she indicated in some way that this is due to a physical or mental condition? And yes, she said she's mentally ill. All right. Well, look what this does. It tells you she's requesting a reasonable accommodation. It kicks in her rights under the ADA. And what's that mean? It means you want to get that medical certification going. And it means that it's time to start the interactive process. Now understand, it really doesn't matter what her medical condition is. What matters are what are the limitations. What is going to be the issue with this condition? What are the limitations? And what do you ask? What can we do to help? That's all you have to do. But you see, if a supervisor doesn't recognize that this is a request for the ADA, you're going to miss it. And that's going to cause a lot of problems for you. In our next case, Angus, you can see that the EEOC held that an employee triggered the interactive process and her ADA rights when she went up to her supervisor and said, hey, I am continuously printing these placards and it's really causing my hands to ache. Well, let's go through the new test. Did the employee ask for an adjustment or change? Well, yeah, I'm asking for some change in not printing these placards as much. And did she say it was related to some medical or mental condition? Well, she said, yeah, it's making her hands ache. That is sufficient enough. Now, whether or not you can accommodate that, that's a whole separate issue. But instantly, that employee is protected by the ADA. That means you've got to get the medical certification paperwork ready. And it means that that's going to start the interactive process to see what a reasonable accommodation might be. And what do you ask her? What can we do to help you? Now here in our next case in Lynch, we've got, and this is a real interesting request for accommodation. This woman told her employer that because of her mobility issues, during a fire, she's going to have to use the elevator. Well, I don't think you can do that. All right, so they're going through these fire drills. Hey, I have mobility issues. I need to use the elevator. Well, that is going to trigger the reasonable accommodation request. That's going to trigger it. Why? Well, I'm asking for an adjustment or change. That's one. Take the elevator. And 2, I have a medical condition. That counts. In another case here, Donahoe, we've got an employee where the EEOC said this triggered the reasonable accommodation request because the employee asked for leave because of her neck and back condition. Well, there you go. I'm asking for a change due to a medical condition. That counts. In another case here, you've got an employee that told her area director that she needs a different computer monitor because the monitor she had then was hurting her eyes and causing headaches. Boom, there you are. I need a new computer. That's an adjustment or change due to the fact that it hurts my eyes, causes me headaches. That's a medical condition, or could be. You see, this standard for determining, okay, what is it that I have to do to say I need a reasonable accommodation? What does the employee have to say? That is not a high standard. And that's, understand, anybody that's been staying up with the ADA since 2011, you have seen the requirements for employees drop and drop and drop and drop, as you'll obviously see in this course. But I'll tell you, are you asking for an adjustment or a change, and is it due to a medical condition? Any employee that says that, your supervisors have to see that as a trigger for the ADA and let someone like Human Resources know. Well, I think we pretty well exhausted what is a request for a reasonable accommodation. So let's look at the flip side and look at what is not a request for a reasonable accommodation. And we've got a case here called Murray. And in this case, the employee claimed that the employer already knew about my limitations. They know I've got this condition. And so the employer talked to the employee. The employer said, okay, got these limitations. What can we do to help you? And the employee told the employer, it's okay. I got it. I'm going to self-monitor as to whether or not I'm going to run into any type of issues. And I'll let you know. Okay. Well, the employer did a good job. They asked. That's the interactive process. The employee said, hey, I got it. And the employee never spoke up and said, hey, I need additional help now. I'm not able to self-monitor. So the employee dropped the ball. The employer won. And really, it's because the employer did a good job. I know about this condition. I'm on top of it, so we're going to talk about it. You told me you got it. The employee dropped the ball. The employer did a good job. That was not a request for accommodation. In another case, Waltz, the employee claimed that, hey, my behavior was so erratic that everybody should have noticed that I wasn't all there or that I needed some help. The employee is saying, I was so bizarre that it was open and obvious that something's wrong with me, and the employer should have guessed. Well, the court came back and the court said, look, just because you're acting erratically, it's not an employer's duty to guess. All right, now, open and obvious, yeah, you're in a wheelchair or something like this, but just because you're bipolar and you're acting kind of strange, that is not enough notice to the employer that you are covered by the ADA. You needed to say something like, hey, I'm having some mental issues and I need some help. Or mentally, I'm struggling and I'm going to need some help with this over here. But you didn't say anything like that. And so there was nothing that triggered the employer to suspect that there was anything wrong with you under the ADA. So guess what? The medical certification was never triggered. The interactive process was never triggered. The employer did what it was supposed to do. In a similar case, you got Keeler. And in Keeler, you've got a woman that admitted that nobody knew about my disability. But she said, look, they should have known that I had a disability because I took lots of notes and I was crying a lot. And I told my employer that my job was very stressful and overwhelming. And then later she'd asked for a transfer. The court came back and they said, no, that's not enough. Well, the reason being, look, she didn't link the two together. And just saying that something is stressful and overwhelming, Well, that's kind of what a job is. Yeah, that's what happens. Everybody feels stressed and overwhelmed from time to time. That is not enough. It is not asking for a change in your job due to a medical condition. No, didn't link the two, not enough. In McCarroll, you got another very vague request here. We had a shuttle bus driver that told his supervisor that he was too sore to report to work. I'm too sore. Well, that's a lot of people on any given day. I'm too sore. No. You got to be more specific than that. That is too vague. All right. Something along the lines would have been acceptable where, oh my gosh, my hip is so sore, I'm going to have to take some time off. Not that I'm too sore to report today. That's too vague. In another case, Parsons, you've got an employee that told a supervisor that, well, my sleep apnea is coming back again. Okay. And he was trouble getting his insurance company to pay for his medical device. Well, okay, he mentioned a medical condition. Sleep apnea is a medical condition, but he's talking about getting his insurance company to pay for his medical device. He never tied it to needing an accommodation or having trouble on the job. You got to tie it to that. Here, he mentioned his medical condition, but he tied it to an insurance problem. The employer is not expected to guess. And here you have another case, Lanier, where basically you've got an employee who, again, never tied the request of being on an alternate on-call rotation due to their insomnia. Basically, she just complained that she was being sleep deprived. Okay, well, I'm feeling sleep deprived, or I'm getting depression, or I have insomnia. Well, you're going to have to tie that to the on-call rotation. Making the employer guess is not enough. So you see, the standard has come down, but you still have to tie your medical condition or mental condition to the reason why you're asking for a change. And I'll tell you, probably the most critical thing in recognizing that an employee is asking for a reasonable accommodation under the ADA is that no magic words are required. I still hear this to this day. Well, the person didn't say that they needed a reasonable accommodation. They didn't say that they're covered by the ADA. They don't have to do any of that. That is not the law today. What do they have to do? They have to say they've got some medical or mental condition and they need a change in work. That's it. And I've given you a couple cases here that basically come right out and tell you there's no magic words that you have to say. And finally, if you look at the EEOC versus Chevron case, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals specifically said, look, the employee just simply has to explain that they need an adjustment and it's due to a medical condition. That's it. So get that out of your supervisor's head, that they got to say ADA or they got to say I'm requesting accommodation. They don't have to say any of that. And I'll tell you, another little landmine out there waiting for HR people and supervisors and organizations, it is very difficult today for an employee to be covered by the FMLA and request time off for themselves and have that not also be an ADA issue. Now, pregnancy could be an example. A normal pregnancy could be a difference. But let's think about this. Oh my gosh, I was injured at home and I need to have surgery on my knee. I'm going to need to have 5 weeks off. Well, I got news for you. That person is going to be covered. If they're covered under the FMLA, let's just assume they are. But look what they've done. They've asked for a change at work due to a medical condition. They're covered by the ADA. And let me just tell you, there are a lot of pitfalls here for employers. One of those pitfalls is so many employers today are not recognizing that that's ADA. Now understand, difference between FMLA and ADA. FMLA, you get up to 12 weeks off. Whether it's paid or unpaid isn't any issue for the FMLA. That's a pay issue. But they get the time off, and they get a similar type of equivalent job back. Under the ADA, they might need time off, but they might also need an accommodation. So let this play out a little bit. Let's say that you've got a situation where you have an employee that needs 3 weeks off under the FMLA, which is also going to be under the ADA due to this knee surgery. Then at 3 weeks, they say, oh, I'm going to have these limitations and these limitations and these limitations. And the employer says, well, why don't you just take some more time off under the FMLA because you're covered by FMLA. Okay, the employee takes time off under the FMLA. You have just violated the ADA. You've just violated the ADA. Why? Because the person needed 3 weeks off. There was no question about that. But now they're ready to come back, but they're going to have some limitations. You have a duty and obligation under the ADA to engage in the interactive process. And you didn't do that. So now you're forcing an employee to take a leave of absence when maybe a stool would have been a good accommodation. I'll tell you, you do not want to mess around with the interactive process. You do not want to violate this. And I'll tell you, in a lot of the circuits out there, a lot of the circuit courts, if you do not engage in the interactive process, you lose. It's that simple. And what's the interactive process? Is there anything we can do to help you? To engage in the interactive process means I want to see what their limitations are. So I'm going to get those from the healthcare provider. And then I'm going to just talk to the person. You can talk to them on the phone. Okay, I see that you can only lift so much weight. You can only do this. Well, you're going to have to at least talk to the person. Can we accommodate them? And you might not be able to. But if you can maybe accommodate them, maybe leave of absence is not necessary, the accommodation. So you want to make sure that you're keeping all these rules between the ADA and the FMLA all in line.